someone this morning sent me a tweet that indicated that in the month of July 2022, last month, China acquired more than 80 tons of gold from Switzerland. Now, that's got to say something. Is China expecting a recession? That's the first question to ask. Is China expecting a devaluation of the dollar? Keep in mind that although the Chinese property market is in trouble, China and Chinese business still has plenty of property and plenty of hold over other countries, including the United States of America. They have got plenty of mineral wealth, including plenty of gold deposits. Earlier this year, when the conflict started in Russia, the gold was confiscated from Russia. Currencies move in cycles. Right now, as we speak, we all talk about the almighty greenback. And for many, many years, the US dollar was the strongest currency around. Having said that, there was a time, believe it or not, when the rand was at parity with the US dollar. And why was the rand at parity with the US dollar? I'll give you one word. It's a four-letter word, starts with a G and ends with a D. That particular time, South Africa controlled the gold market. We were the biggest gold producer. We had immense gold reserves, and we were extracting this wonderful shiny yellow metal out of the ground. The whole way that currency came about really had to do with little IOUs, separate banks, because we didn't have centralized banks in the early days. So how and why did this change? Because it changed several times in history. The most recent time was in 1971. Richard Nixon suddenly made a surprise announcement that America was coming off the gold standard. And America went into a recession during those years. In fact, it was a period of high inflation and recession, which we refer to as stagflation, and very much the climate that we're seeing at the moment. Although there's a bit of uncertainty in terms of how long the oil price will stay elevated, but certainly that's been one of the drivers of the current inflationary environment that we see. And we've had 2 quarters of negative growth from America, and technically that's a recession. Now, why did Nixon want to come off the gold standard? Well, he knew that he still needed to pay plenty of wage bills. Remember, America had just spent a fortune on the Vietnam War. 1971 was towards the end of that Vietnam War, and that cost America a fortune. So America's deficit was accumulating. They started owing money. So Nixon basically just made a unilateral decision and said, look, I'm not sticking to Bretton Woods anymore. Our currency is not backed by the gold standard. And of course the American dollar plummeted initially, but eventually recovered.
What happened in 1971 was that the Bretton Woods system got abolished. The Bretton Woods system was such that the dollar itself was pegged to the gold, and the rest of the currencies were therefore fixed or pegged to the US dollar. And the US dollar began to be a currency of reserve as early as 1940s. Actually, the Bretton Woods institutions, when they were being formed around 1940s, 1945, that's when the UK British pound lost its reserve currency status towards the US. The demand for gold by France from the US became clear that the Fort Knox, as my colleague puts it, had no gold at all that would be given to each country that would demand it. Therefore, the President Nixon, abandoned the gold standard backing.
So coming back to why Nixon wanted them to come off the gold standard was basically he wanted to continue to print money. He would have had to have practiced austerity. Now, austerity is basically a fancy word for tightening your belt. You've got to start getting rid of certain expenses, stopping that DSTV subscription, cutting out expenses where you can. And for a government, that means maybe cutting the wage bill, cutting the spending on war efforts, etc., etc. And most countries don't want to go under austerity, so having your currency backed by gold and not having enough gold or enough money to purchase more gold to back your currency creates problems for government. And we saw this happen after the world banking crisis in 2008 as well. Quantitative easing, which is just the fancy word really for printing of money, occurred again. And America started to accumulate expensive amounts of debt, frightening amounts of debt. Yet the dollar has stayed pretty stable through all of this. Technically though, you should look at the balance sheet of that government to know if that paper's worth anything.
Well, analysts continue to speculate on the implications of an international reserve currency planned by Russia and China amid fears that the US might be facing a recession. Now, the announcement of a reserve currency was made by Russian President Vladimir Putin during the BRICS summit in June.
Yeah, a reserve currency is that dominant currency in which transactions, economic transactions, are mostly used. In a region, in a continent, globally. So in this case, we have the US dollar as the preeminent reserve currency.
America has people stationed everywhere. NATO essentially is pulled by America. They're pulling the puppet strings of the United Nations as well. And they have people spread globally working for the United Nations, for NATO, etc. This has all been funded by American dollars and by the American taxpayer. So just think about this for a minute. And again, this channel's not about conspiracy theories, just about critical thinking and creating opportunities for thought and education. So a virus comes out of a lab in Wuhan. There's no dispute about where the origin of that virus came from. That virus closes down the world and closes down China more than the rest of the world. When the rest of the world opens up, China still stays closed. They have got plenty of property that can be sold. In fact, there's a surplus there. So iron ore and building and other materials that the world really relies on. The world has relied on China's growth of 8-9, dropping down to 7.5% in more recent years per annum, and the amount of resources and commodities that China's been buying. And now suddenly they've put the brakes on it when this virus came out. They have enough infrastructure. The infrastructure is great. They have sufficient property to take care of the population growth for a good few years. Is there a bigger picture? Is there a strategy here? One needs to think about this because nations do strategize. Some of them strategize by creating wars, but the goal of many nations is to make sure that you have the reserve currency of the world. When Britain was able to overrule Holland, it was because Holland had accumulated a lot of debt, and Holland was in economic decline. The pound sterling and UK and Britain lost their reserve currency status as the British Empire started folding and collapsing, also due to the accumulation of debt. So what I'm saying is there's a little bit of history repeating itself, because if you really look at things from an objective point of view, you would have to admit that America is in a terrible economic state.
We are witnessing a new international financial order in the making. Whether we like it or not, there is a new financial order that is being developed as an alternative to the dollar-euro dominated international financial order, mainly because of what Reggie said, which is the abuse of the current system by the United States and its allies.
The United States has been freezing assets at least since World War I, since 1917. This is how we got Bear aspirin. We took it from the Germans in World War I.
You know, but the idea that we have turned the dollar into a weapon and just gone out there and started to seize hundreds of billions of dollars worth of sovereign wealth from Russia, and then also, you know, with the oligarchs and everything else, you know, we're just seizing this stuff because, well, we're mad at you and we don't like you.
Thirdly, allow me to observe that you cannot separate money from war. The two are interlinked because the most profitable business in the world is a war. There is no war in history that has made a loss. This is why Cicero said, money is the soul of the war. So if all wars are profitable, then we can trace the rise of not only reserve currencies, but currencies themselves to war.
And while just as Russia wants to expand relations with North Korea, it is warning the United States that it may cut bilateral ties with America. A senior Russian official says Moscow has told Washington that if the U.S. Senate passes a law singling out Russia as the state sponsor of terrorism, diplomatic ties would be badly damaged and could even be broken off. Alexander Dachev, head of the Foreign Ministry's North American Department, was quoted as saying the U.S. influence in Ukraine had increased to the degree that Americans are increasingly becoming more and more a direct party in the conflict. The US and Europe, where they are being dragged directly into the war, have refused Ukraine's requests to establish a no-fly zone to help it protect its skies from Russian missiles and warplanes.
When the Massachusetts Bay Colony printed the first banknotes in the United States way back in 1690, it was to fund its military operations. Again, in 1914, when the First World War, the so-called First World War ended, that is when we saw the rise of the United States dollar as the global reserve currency, courtesy of the meeting that occurred at the Bretton Woods institutions. So we see a direct link between war and currencies. So what are the implications for the United States if I now go back to your question? Firstly, there is going to be inflation at home. Inflation is going to visit the United States of America. Secondly, the United States is now going to fight in many fronts because remember, there is already a challenge that is coming from digital currencies such as blockchain technologies as an alternative to the US dollar hegemony. So now it is going to be fighting on two fronts. Thirdly, the de-dollarization, this process that is happening, will expose the reality that the gold that is presumed to be in Fort Knox is not there. And finally, the US veto at the IMF and the World Bank will become obsolete.
Certainly the time is ripe for a new global empire, for a new reserve currency. And here's China busy accumulating gold. There's talk of a BRICS currency, which will be great for India, for Russia, for South Africa. It'll be interesting to see how it develops. All I'm saying is that within this picture is gold. And there's a lot of discussion, and we mentioned it before, that the gold price seems to be artificially suppressed. For some reason, if you actually look at the trade of coins over the market and the trade of jewelry over the market, it's often traded at a significantly higher price than spot. And so there's this financial manipulation of the gold price. But generally when it comes to bullion, the actual bars, they traded at that spot gold price. And between Switzerland and China, they would have paid spot for gold. Now, if they bought it in July, I'm not sure exactly when and at what stage, but the price was pushed down a bit in the month of July. They may well still be buying. But if they release a currency that's backed by gold, what do you think would happen?
So you've got the US, this is the reserve currency. I mean, when we see it, I mean, Prof, you spoke about a failed state and, you know, the dollar automatically comes in. I mean, we look at something like our neighboring country, Zimbabwe. I mean, this is what happens. This comes in. But who makes the decision that the dollar won't be that currency anymore because there are so many complexities in geopolitics. I mean, at the moment, when we look at war with the Europe and the Ukraine, I mean, all of these things that are going on there in Russia, we now see this visit that's taking place, we see Nancy Pelosi from US moving and going and visiting Taiwan, and there are massive tensions now between the US and China. So there's definitely a big global shift taking place. So who decides what this new currency is going to be, what the implications are for a new global reserve currency, and can we rely on an economy like Russia, for instance? Because Russia, with all of these sanctions against it, yes, of course, they are holding up very well, but when we look into the future, are they still going to hold up very well? Let's perhaps look at that. Prof, do you want to talk politics, currencies, and who determines what that next reserve currency is?
You asked a very important question. Who determines and how do they determine it? I think there is something that is called leadership. When leaders decide to abandon one paradigm and shift to another, it then causes seismic shifts. For now, we see that China, India, Iran, and Turkey, among themselves, they are already trading in their currencies. What does this mean? That they are sidelining the United States dollar, just these 4 countries. It means that at present, the global market is excluding 3 billion people from the US dollar-dominated international system. Over 3 billion people no longer need to use the United States dollar to trade with one another. This is just a fraction of the global south. I am just talking about 4 economies here. So as more countries continue to move away from the petrodollar system, from the US euro dominancy, which uses the US dollar as the payment for oil, we expect massive inflationary pressures to strike the United States economy. But the most important thing, Leanne, is that the United States is not going to take this lying down. Of course, the United Kingdom did it when the pound sterling was usurped by the United States dollar. But I don't think that the United States will simply sit and watch and see the United States dollar being rendered a worthless currency like the Zimbabwean dollar. So we are most likely going to see a fight back. Now, going back to the theme of war, Ukraine is receiving aid from all over the West. Right now, at the last check, I think they received 60 billion. How are they going to pay back that money? This is where the issue of resources comes in. Remember how the United States became rich after the war. It is because all the European countries now had to pay back the money that the United States had used to finance the war. And this is how the United States became a very strong economy. There are innuendos that the maneuvers that are happening in Taiwan are to provoke China into a type of Russian reaction so that the United States can gauge how far China is willing to go.
Well, think about what would happen to the US dollar. The US dollar stops becoming the reserve currency of the world, and they have all this debt that they're busy accumulating. We know exactly what's going to happen to the US dollar. And if the US dollar falls so much, and China controls the reserve currency, and people are prepared to trade in whatever this reserve currency is called, call it BRICS if you like, it'll make very interesting picture, because it'll basically mean a shift in the global empire. So this is another reason why I think one can't take a short-term view on gold. You need to realize that gold is something that you have to have in your portfolio just as a form of safety, because keep in mind that if the gold price needs to back a currency again, and it's been suppressed at the moment in the region of $1,700, $1,800, $1,800, whatever it may be, and the dollar now devalues, that gold price is going to skyrocket. If the US dollar devalues significantly, in terms of translating back to US dollars, gold could easily reach $10,000. Now, that's not a stupid suggestion. Really think about it. And I'd love you to comment on this video and tell me why you think I'm wrong, if you think I'm wrong. If you think I'm right, I'd like to hear about that as well, or if there's some flaws in the general theory. But I haven't sort of expounded my entire theory here. This is just for educational purposes and to get you thinking about what gold's purpose has been globally, what a currency's purpose is, and the shift in dynamics. It sometimes takes a century or so to play out, sometimes 2 centuries, in terms of who's going to be the dominant world empire that controls the form of exchange. Now, I think that's why Bitcoin has been so popular, coming back to the beginning of the discussion. I think that cryptocurrencies and so on have become popular because people realize that the dollar is just a piece of paper. It's worth nothing really. And you want something that can be easily exchanged. So gold coins and gold bullion is not a good means of exchange. In fact, it's never, in my mind, been considered a currency or a means of exchange. It's more of a store of wealth. Then the medium of exchange sits on top of it with that store of wealth backing it. And that's the way I see gold. And that's all I want to share with you today. Thanks for watching. Please watch one of my other videos. I've already done one on my views of gold. And please feel free to comment and I will respond.
In simple terms, Lien, who determines what then becomes the global reserve currency is the strongest among us. So again, we are back to the issue of war and the military. And if we may link it to Africa, there are very strong arguments that the main reason why the Colonel brother leader Muammar Gadaffi was assassinated was because he was championing the use of the gold standard or the gold coin as a central currency for African countries. But that is a debate for another day.